King Philip II of France lies in the mud, unhorsed, his royal standard fallen. Enemy knights swarming over him like wolves on a wounded stag. German soldiers tear at his armor, trying to find gaps where daggers can slide between plates to reach flesh. One knight raises a mace high, aiming for the French king's helmeted head, a blow that, if it lands, will shatter not just a skull, but the future of France itself. Around the fallen monarch, the battle rages with apocalyptic fury. 15,000 warriors clash on the muddy plains between the villages of Bouvines and Kaiserwing, their war cries drowning out the Sunday church bells that still ring from distant steeples. This is supposed to be the Lord's Day, a day of peace when Christian knights should not shed Christian blood. But today, that sacred rule lies trampled in the mud alongside the bodies of the fallen. The stakes could not be higher. On this single field, the fate of kingdoms hangs in balance. If Philip dies here, France, barely a coherent nation, will fragment back into feudal chaos. The Angevin Empire, ruled by the English King John, will reassert dominance over French lands. The Holy Roman Empire will dictate terms to a humbled French nobility. 700 years of French history will be erased before it can be written. But as the German knight's mace descends toward Philip's head, French men-at-arms crash into the attackers. Pierre Mauvoisin, a minor noble whose name would otherwise be forgotten, throws himself between the king and death, taking a sword thrust through the shoulder. Gautier the Young, another household knight, drives his lance through a German's throat. Within seconds, a protective circle of French warriors surrounds their king, shields locked, weapons bloody, defying an entire enemy army. Philip struggles to his feet, dazed but alive. Blood streams from a cut on his forehead, mixing with sweat and mud. His breath comes in ragged gasps inside his helmet. For a moment, just a moment, he sees the magnitude of what hangs on this day's outcome. Then he grabs a sword from a dead knight, raises it high so his army can see he lives, and bellows a battle cry that will echo through French history. Montjoie Saint-Denis. The French battle cry ripples across the field. Soldiers who thought their king dead surge forward with renewed fury. The tide of battle, which had turned against France, begins to turn back. And on a summer Sunday afternoon in Flanders, the modern nation of France is being born in blood and steel. This is the story of how one battle, fought in 5 hours on a summer day, changed the course of European history forever. Philip II was born in 1165, the only son of King Louis VII and his third wife, Adela of Champagne. His birth was so desperately awaited. His father had divorced his first wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, partly because she gave him only daughters, that he was given the title Dieudonné, God-given. The name Augustus, which he adopted, himself declared his ambition to be the first among kings, as the Roman Emperor Augustus had been first among citizens. By 1214, at age 49, Philip had been king for 34 years. He had transformed France from a fragmented collection of feudal territories into something approaching a centralized kingdom. He had more than doubled the size of the royal domain, wresting Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and parts of Poitou from English control. He had fortified Paris, paved its streets, and built the Louvre fortress. He had created a professional administration to govern his expanding realm. Philip Augustus was the first French king to think strategically rather than merely dynastically, observes Dr. Jim Bradbury, medieval military historian. He understood that building a strong kingdom required not just winning battles, but creating institutions, controlling territory, and weakening rivals through diplomacy as much as warfare. Contemporary descriptions portray Philip as slightly above average height, strongly built, with prematurely balding head and ruddy complexion. He was neither handsome nor charming. Chronicles note his tendency toward suspicion and his lack of the courtly graces that marked his rival, Richard the Lionheart. But what Philip lacked in charisma, He compensated with cunning, patience, and an almost ruthless pragmatism. He was also genuinely pious, attending Mass daily and funding religious institutions generously, though critics noted his piety never prevented him from pursuing political advantage, even against the Church when necessary. He had been on crusade with Richard I, though the two had quarreled bitterly, and Philip had returned early, claiming illness. By July 1214, Philip's great project of building French royal power faced its ultimate test. A grand coalition of his enemies had assembled the largest army yet seen in medieval Europe, determined to crush France once and for all. Otto IV of Brunswick, Holy Roman Emperor, was in many ways Philip's opposite. Born around 1170, he was the third son of Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, and Matilda of England, daughter of Henry II. His family, the Welfs or Guelfs, had been locked in generations-long conflict with the rival Hohenstaufen dynasty for control of the Holy Roman Empire. Otto's path to imperial power had been circuitous and controversial. After his rival, Philip of Swabia, was murdered in 1208, Otto was crowned emperor. But he soon alienated Pope Innocent III by attempting to conquer Sicily, leading to his excommunication in 1210. The Pope then supported a rival candidate, the young Frederick II of Hohenstaufen. By 1214, Otto was fighting for political survival. Excommunicated, challenged by a papal-backed rival, he needed a dramatic military victory to restore his prestige and secure his throne. An alliance with England and Flanders against France offered that opportunity. Contemporary sources describe Otto as tall and physically imposing, with yellow hair and a commanding presence. He was brave to the point of recklessness, preferring to lead from the front rather than direct battles from safety. Unlike Philip's calculating nature, Otto was impulsive, generous to his followers, and prone to dramatic gestures. Otto represented the old model of medieval kingship, personal valor, largesse to supporters, and the belief that military prowess could solve political problems, notes Dr. John France, author of Western Warfare in the Age of the Crusades. He was in many ways an anachronism facing a modern opponent. King John of England, known to history as John Lackland, was perhaps the most hated monarch in English history. The youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, John had inherited the Angevin Empire in 1199 after his brother Richard's death. Within 5 years, he had lost most of the French territories his ancestors had held for generations. John's losses to Philip Augustus had been catastrophic. Normandy fell in 1204. Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and most of Poitou followed. The English barons, many of whom held lands in France, were furious. By 1214, John had assembled a grand coalition, himself attacking from the southwest, Otto and the Count of Flanders from the northeast, in a coordinated campaign to crush Philip between two armies. But John would not be at Bouvines. His campaign in Poitou had failed, and he had retreated to England before the decisive battle occurred. His absence would prove symbolic. When the crisis came, John was never where he needed to be. John's great tragedy was that he inherited an impossible situation and lacked the political skill or military genius to manage it, reflects Dr. Mark Morris, author of King John, Treachery and Tyranny in Medieval England. He was not the monster of legend, but he was fundamentally unsuited to the challenges he faced. The coalition against France included other significant figures. Ferrand, Count of Flanders, a young, ambitious noble who had sided with the coalition, hoping to gain independence from French suzerainty. Handsome, brave, but politically naive, Ferrand would pay dearly for his choice. William Longsword, Earl of Salisbury, John's half-brother, leading the English contingent at Bouvines. A renowned warrior, he commanded perhaps the finest English knights. Renaud de Damartin, Count of Boulogne, a French traitor who had defected to the coalition, bringing valuable military expertise and local knowledge. On the French side, Philip could count on loyal vassals like the Duke of Burgundy, the Count of Champagne, and Bishop Guérin of Senlis, the latter a warrior priest who would play a crucial role in the battle. To understand Bouvines, we must first understand the Angevin Empire. When Henry II of England married Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152, he united vast French territories under English royal control. By the time he became King of England in 1154, Henry ruled England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and claimed overlordship of Brittany, more of France than the French king controlled. This created an impossible situation for French monarchs. Theoretically, the English kings were vassals of France for their continental holdings. In practice, they were more powerful than their supposed overlord. Philip's entire reign had been dedicated to reversing this situation. The death of Richard the Lionheart in 1199 and John's accession gave Philip his opportunity. John's murder of his nephew Arthur of Brittany in 1203 provided the legal pretext. As John's feudal overlord, Philip declared John's French fiefs forfeit for the crime of murder and began military conquest of Normandy. The loss of Normandy in 1204 was catastrophic for England. The duchy had been English for 150 years, was economically vital, and many English barons held lands there. John spent the next decade planning revenge. By 1213, John had assembled a formidable coalition. He allied with Otto IV, who saw France as supporting his rival Frederick II, the Count of Flanders, bribed with promises of territorial gains. The Duke of Brabant, lured by English gold. Various Rhineland lords seeking plunder and adventure. The plan was elegant in conception. John would attack from the southwest through Poitou, pinning French forces, while Otto's massive army invaded from the northeast. Philip would be caught between two fires and crushed. The coalition assembled perhaps 9,000 to 12,000 warriors for the northern army, an enormous force by medieval standards. They included Otto's German knights, Flemish infantry famous for their skill with pikes and hooks, English knights under William Longsword, and various mercenaries and adventurers. Philip, warned of the approaching storm, could muster perhaps 7,000 and 8,000 men. He was outnumbered, his treasury strained, and facing enemies on two fronts. By any rational calculation, France should lose, but Philip had two advantages: interior lines of communication allowing him to concentrate forces quickly, and superior intelligence about enemy movements. And he was about to prove that quality could overcome quantity. Thomas de Saint-Valery was a Norman knight, age 32, who found himself on the most difficult journey of his life in the summer of 1214. His family had held lands in Normandy for 4 generations under English rule. But when Philip conquered Normandy in 1204, Thomas had faced an impossible choice: swear allegiance to the French king and keep his lands, or remain loyal to England and lose everything. He had chosen France, swearing homage to Philip. But now, as Otto's army approached, Thomas would face English knights he had trained with, fought beside, considered brothers. In a letter to his wife, written the night before Bouvines, Thomas wrote, "Tomorrow I may kill men I called friends, or be killed by them. I have prayed for guidance, but received no answer save silence. I fight for the king who holds my lands, against the king who held my father's loyalty. God grant this civil war among Christians ends soon, for it tears the soul to pieces." Thomas would survive Bouvines, fighting in Philip's household guard. He would be among those who pulled the king from beneath attacking Germans, taking a sword cut to his face that left him scarred for life. But he would keep his lands, father 5 children, and die peacefully in his bed in 1247. An old man who had witnessed the birth of France. Not all participants were noble knights. Jehan, his surname is lost to history, was a crossbowman from Amiens, part of the urban militia Philip had begun incorporating into his armies. At 26, he was a tradesman, a leather worker, who served in the militia for pay and out of obligation to his city. His account, preserved in a chronicle by a monk who interviewed him years later, provides a rare common soldier's perspective. The nobles speak of honor and glory, but we foot soldiers knew only fear and exhaustion. We had marched for days in summer heat, eating little, sleeping in fields. The morning of battle, my hands shook so badly I could barely load my crossbow. When the German knights charged, the earth shook. I had never seen so many armored horsemen. I shot my bolt. Whether it hit anyone, I'll never know. Men around me were screaming prayers, curses, battle cries. One boy from my city, barely 16, pissed himself in terror. No shame in that. I might have too if I'd had anything left in my bladder. But when word came the king was down, something changed. It wasn't courage exactly, more like rage. These foreign knights thought they could ride into France, kill our king, take our lands. Not while we still lived. We might die, but we'd make them pay for every foot of French soil. Jehan survived the battle unwounded, remarkably lucky for a foot soldier. He returned to Amiens, resumed his trade, and lived to see his grandson. But every July 27th for the rest of his life, he attended Mass for those who fell at Bouvines. On the coalition side, we have the testimony of a young squire, also named Otto, who served the emperor. At 17, he was experiencing his first major battle, having trained for years for this moment. His account, written decades later as an old man, reveals the human dimension of defeat. I believed we could not lose. Our army seemed infinite. German knights in their finest armor, Flemish pikemen who had never known defeat, English lords famous throughout Christendom. The French were outnumbered, already exhausted from forced marches. Victory seemed ordained, but then everything went wrong. Their knights hit us harder than I imagined possible. Our formations broke where they should have held. Men I thought invincible were pulled from horses and killed like common soldiers. When the emperor's standard fell, I knew we were doomed. I saw Otto himself, fighting like a demon, trying to rally the army through sheer courage. But courage wasn't enough. I fled. God forgive me. I fled. I dropped my weapons and ran. Hearing French, knights thundering behind me, expecting every moment to feel a lance between my shoulders. I survived. I wish I hadn't. Survival meant living with the memory of that day, of watching an emperor humbled, an army destroyed, and knowing I had run rather than die with honor. If you appreciate stories like this, where the grand sweep of history intersects with individual human experiences, where the decisions made in a single afternoon ripple across centuries, please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments about which side you would have chosen to fight for in this complex conflict, and subscribe to journey with us through more pivotal moments when ordinary people shaped extraordinary events. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these forgotten voices back to life. Philip had been campaigning in Flanders, besieging the city of Tournai, when his scouts brought word. Otto's massive army was approaching from the northeast. The French king faced a critical decision. He could withdraw south toward Paris, avoiding battle but abandoning his territorial gains. Or he could stand and fight, risking everything on a single engagement. Philip chose to fight, but on his terms. He broke camp from Tournai and began marching southwest, not in retreat but searching for favorable ground. Otto, scenting victory, pursued. His army was larger, confident, and eager for battle. For 3 days, the two armies shadowed each other across Flanders. The march was grueling. Summer heat exhausted armored knights. Horses needed constant water. Infantry struggled to maintain the pace. Philip's army, more compact and better organized, moved faster than Otto's sprawling coalition force. Contemporary chronicles speak of the tension during these days. Both armies knew a decisive battle was imminent. Knights checked armor and weapons repeatedly. Priests heard confessions. Letters were written to wives and children, just in case. Sunday, July 27, 1214. dawned hot and humid. Philip's army had reached the bridge over the Marque River at Bouvines. The king intended to cross the bridge and continue south, but his rearguard reported Otto's army was almost upon them. Philip faced another critical decision. Crossing the river now would leave his army vulnerable, strung out on both banks, but to stand and fight meant violating the truce of God, the church law prohibiting warfare on Sundays. Philip convened his war council. The debate was heated. Some councillors urged immediate crossing to avoid Sunday battle. Others argued that fleeing would demoralize the army and allow Otto to dictate terms. Bishop Guérin of Senlis settled the matter. Better to fight on the Lord's Day than see France destroyed on the Lord's Day. Philip gave the order. The army would deploy for battle. The location was not ideal, but not terrible. The field near Bouvines was relatively flat, suitable for cavalry, with the village and river protecting the French rear. The ground was muddy from recent rains, which would slow cavalry charges somewhat. Philip arranged his forces in 3 divisions, following standard medieval practice. Right wing, Duke Otto of Burgundy, commanding heavy cavalry. Center, Philip himself with the royal household troops and the oriflamme, sacred battle standard of France. Left wing, Count Robert II of Dreux with more heavy cavalry. Infantry and crossbowmen were interspersed among the cavalry rather than formed in separate units, an innovation that would prove crucial. Otto deployed similarly. Right wing, William Longsword with English and northern French rebels. Center, Otto himself with German heavy cavalry and infantry. Left wing, Ferrand of Flanders with Flemish infantry and cavalry. Both armies deployed approximately 3,000 to 4,000 heavy cavalry, supplemented by infantry, crossbowmen, and sergeants. The coalition had numerical superiority, perhaps 11,000 to France's 8,000, but not overwhelming advantage. The battle began with the coalition right wing, William Longsword's English and rebel French, charging the French left under Robert of Dreux. The sound was tremendous. Hundreds of armored horsemen at full gallop, lances leveled, war cries filling the air. The impact was devastating. English knights, among the finest in Europe, smashed into the French line. Men were catapulted from saddles. Horses screamed and fell. The clash of steel on steel could be heard for miles. For a moment, the French left wavered. William Longsword fought magnificently, his sword rising and falling in deadly rhythm. His knights drove deeper into French lines, threatening to turn the entire French position. But Philip had anticipated this. He had positioned infantry equipped with pikes and hooks among his cavalry. As English knights penetrated the French line, they found themselves surrounded by foot soldiers who pulled them from horses and dispatched them with daggers thrust through armor joints. The French also employed a controversial weapon, crossbowmen who specifically targeted horses. Medieval chivalric codes discouraged this. Horses were valuable property, and killing them seemed dishonorable. But Philip had no time for outdated honor codes. His crossbowmen shot horses from under English knights, leaving them vulnerable on foot in heavy armor. While the wings battled, the center saw the war's decisive action. Otto, leading from the front as was his nature, charged directly at Philip's position. The emperor's target was clear. The oriflamme, France's sacred battle standard. Capturing or destroying it would demoralize French forces and perhaps end the battle. Otto's charge was magnificent and terrible. German heavy cavalry, the shock troops of Europe, crashed into French lines with overwhelming force. Knights fell like wheat before scythes. The French center bent, buckled, and threatened to break entirely. It was during this crisis that Philip's horse was killed under him. The king crashed to the ground, stunned. German knights, recognizing the royal armor, swarmed over him. For perhaps 90 seconds, the fate of France hung by a thread. Contemporary chronicles describe this moment with breathless drama. One German knight supposedly shouted, "The French king is down. Victory is ours." But Pierre Mauvoisin and other household knights reached Philip first, forming a protective shield wall around their king. The fighting around the fallen king was savage beyond description. Men fought hand to hand, using swords, maces, daggers, any weapon that could kill. Blood turned the muddy ground into a slippery morass. Wounded men were trampled by horses. The air filled with screams, prayers, and the terrible wet sounds of edged weapons cutting flesh. Philip struggled to his feet, grabbed a weapon, and resumed fighting. His survival and visible presence rallied French forces. Fresh troops charged into the melee around the king, pushing the Germans back through sheer ferocity. On the French right, Duke Otto of Burgundy faced Philip of Flanders and his infantry. The Flemish had deployed their famous pike formations. Infantry armed with 12-foot pikes formed into squares that could break cavalry charges. These formations were virtually impregnable from the front. But Otto was a veteran commander who understood infantry vulnerabilities. He refused to charge the pike squares frontally. Instead, he used mounted crossbowmen and light cavalry to harass the Flemish from a distance, shooting into the densely packed formations where every bolt was likely to hit someone. The Flemish, trained to resist cavalry charges but not prolonged missile bombardment, began to waver. Some units broke formation to chase the harassing horsemen, exactly what Otto wanted. Once formations opened, French heavy cavalry charged through the gaps, turning ordered resistance into chaos. Ferrand, commanding from the front, found himself surrounded. His personal guard fought desperately to protect him, but French numbers overwhelmed them. The young count was pulled from his horse, beaten unconscious with mace blows to his helmet, and taken prisoner. With the French left holding against William Longsword, the center rallied around Philip, and the right collapsing the Flemish, Otto faced catastrophic defeat. His army was being destroyed piece by piece. The sacred oriflamme still flew, Philip still lived, and German casualties mounted by the minute. Otto, brave but not suicidal, recognized the battle was lost. His advisors urged immediate retreat. The emperor, blood-spattered and exhausted, made the hardest decision of his life. He would abandon the field. But Otto's flight nearly ended in disaster. French knights, recognizing the imperial standard, pursued relentlessly. The emperor's guard fought a running battle, sacrificing themselves to buy Otto time to escape. His standard-bearer was killed. The imperial eagle captured, a humiliation that would haunt Otto for his remaining years. According to chronicles, Otto rode so hard his horse died under him. He commandeered another and kept riding, not stopping until he reached Valenciennes, miles from the battlefield. Behind him, his army disintegrated. William Longsword, seeing Otto's flight and realizing the battle was lost, attempted an organized retreat. His English knights formed a fighting square, backing slowly toward safety while holding off French pursuit. It was a gallant effort, but ultimately futile. French cavalry surrounded the English square. Longsword was finally pulled from his horse and captured. With both Otto and Longsword gone, coalition resistance collapsed entirely. What followed was massacre. Fleeing soldiers were ridden down by French cavalry, some drowned trying to cross rivers. Others were killed by local peasants who emerged from hiding to loot the dying and finish off the wounded. Medieval warfare was brutal in victory. Bouvines was no exception. By sunset, the battlefield was a charnel house. Bodies lay thick enough that horses couldn't walk without stepping on corpses. The air stank of blood, shit, and death. Wounded men groaned in agony, begging for water or death. Crows already circled overhead. French casualties were relatively light, perhaps 400 to 500 dead, mostly infantry. Coalition losses were catastrophic, 3,000 to 4,000 dead, including many nobles and nearly 2,000 prisoners, including 5 counts, William Longsword and Ferrand of Flanders. Otto's army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The day after the battle, Philip ordered a mass for the dead, all the dead, French and coalition alike. It was a gesture of Christian piety and political calculation. Philip could afford magnanimity and total victory. The prisoners were treated according to their rank. Count of Flanders was taken to Paris and imprisoned in the Louvre for the next 13 years. William Longsword was similarly imprisoned until ransomed 5 years later. Common soldiers were often ransomed for modest sums or released after swearing not to fight France again. Philip's return to Paris was a triumph that Romans would have recognized. The king entered the city on August the 5th, greeted by wildly celebrating crowds. Church bells rang continuously, wine flowed in the streets. Poets composed songs about the victory that would be sung for generations. The celebration lasted for 7 days and nights. Scholars from the new University of Paris composed Latin hymns celebrating Philip's victory. The clergy declared Bouvines a miracle, divine validation of French kingship. Philip himself attended Mass daily, publicly thanking God for deliverance. The reaction to Bouvines in France suggests how precarious the kingdom had felt, observes Dr. Elizabeth Hallam, specialist in Capetian, France. The celebrations were not just about military victory, but relief. France had been on the brink of dismemberment and had survived. Bouvines transformed Philip from king to national savior. The battle's political consequences rippled across Europe. In France, Philip's prestige soared. The victory validated his conquests in Normandy and elsewhere. French royal authority, previously contested by powerful nobles, became unchallengeable. The battle is often cited as the moment when France became a true nation-state rather than a collection of feudal territories. In England, John returned to find his barons in open revolt. Bankrupt from his failed campaign, humiliated by defeat, he had lost all credibility. Within a year, the barons would force him to sign Magna Carta, 1215, limiting royal power. Bouvines didn't directly cause Magna Carta, but it created the political conditions that made it inevitable. In the Holy Roman Empire, Otto's authority evaporated. He retreated to his ancestral lands in Brunswick and never recovered his position. Frederick II, the papal-backed rival, consolidated power. Otto would die in 1218, a broken man whose empire had died at Bouvines. In Flanders, the county was absorbed more directly into French royal authority. Ferrand's long imprisonment prevented any recovery of independence. Flanders would remain in the French orbit for generations. Bouvines was the battle that created France, declares Dr. Georges Duby, the preeminent French medieval historian, in his seminal work on the battle. Before 1214, France was a geographical expression. After Bouvines, it was a nation. The battle's long-term significance is hard to overstate. National identity. Bouvines became a founding myth of French identity. The victory was portrayed as all France united under its king against foreign invaders. Anniversary celebrations continued for centuries. The battle entered French collective memory as the moment when France proved it could defend itself. Royal authority, the victory gave Philip and his successors unassailable prestige. The French monarchy would build on this foundation to create the absolutist state of Louis XIV. Nobles who had hesitated to recognize royal authority found resistance futile after Bouvines. Territorial integrity. The battle confirmed French control over Normandy, Anjou, and other territories taken from England. These would remain French, establishing the territorial core of modern France. The Capetian dynasty. Philip's victory secured the Capetian dynasty for another 3 centuries. His descendants would rule France until the Revolution, an extraordinary longevity partially based on the legitimacy earned at Bouvines. For England, Bouvines was equally significant, but in opposite direction. Loss of continental empire. The Angevin Empire was finished. England would never again control large swaths of France, though later kings would try during the 100 Years' War. English kings would increasingly focus on Britain rather than continental territories. Magna Carta. The political crisis created by John's failure led directly to Magna Carta in 1215. This document, forced on John by rebellious barons, established principles of limited government that would eventually lead to constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy. English identity, losing France, ultimately helped England develop a distinct national identity. No longer French lords who happened to rule England, English kings became English. The language shifted from French to English. A separate English culture emerged. Bouvines paradoxically benefited England in the long term, argues Dr. Mark Morris. The Angevin Empire was unsustainable. Losing it forced England to develop as a distinct nation rather than as an offshore extension of France. English democracy arguably grew from the political crisis Bouvines created. Bouvines also affected the broader European political system, weakening of empire. The Holy Roman Empire never recovered its prestige. After Otto's defeat, the empire would be increasingly German rather than universal, focused on Central Europe rather than claiming authority over all Christendom. Rise of national kingdoms. The battle demonstrated that well-organized national kingdoms could defeat imperial coalitions. The future belonged to France, England, Castile, centralized monarchies, not to the universal empire ideal. Military evolution. The battle's tactics influenced medieval warfare for generations. Philip's integration of infantry with cavalry, his use of crossbowmen against horses, his emphasis on discipline over individual heroism, these became models for later commanders. Behind the political consequences lay human tragedy. Thousands of men died at Bouvines, each death a small apocalypse for families left behind. Medieval battles were class warfare made literal. Nobles were captured for ransom, common soldiers were killed. Among the French dead was Guillaume des Barres, a champion knight who had fought in tournaments and battlefields across Europe. He died defending Philip when the king was unhorsed, taking a German lance through his chest. He left a wife and 3 children. His eldest son would grow up hearing stories of his father's heroism, would himself become a knight, and would die at the Battle of Taillebourg in 1242, fighting for France as his father had. On the coalition side, Count Arnaud Amaury of Narbonne, a crusade veteran, died in the initial cavalry clash. He had fought Muslims in Spain, heretics in southern France, and met his end fighting fellow Christians in Flanders. His body was never recovered. He likely lies in one of the mass graves near Bouvines. His noble lineage ended in Flemish mud. Ferrand of Flanders spent 13 years imprisoned in the Louvre. When finally released in 1227, he was 47 years old, his youth spent in a cell. He lived only 6 more years, dying in 1233 without having recovered Flanders' independence. His young wife, Jean, waited for him, a remarkable fidelity in an age when political marriages were business arrangements. William Longsword survived 5 years of imprisonment before being ransomed. He returned to England to find John dead, the young Henry III on the throne, and his own influence greatly diminished. He would spend his remaining years, he died in 1226, as a minor figure, his reputation damaged by defeat at Bouvines despite his gallant fighting. For common soldiers, Bouvines' consequences depended on which side they fought. French infantry returned home as heroes. Jehan, the crossbowman, whose testimony we heard earlier, received a silver coin from the king, a fortune for a tradesman, an exemption from certain taxes. His status in Amiens rose. He was elected to the city council, married well, and lived comfortably. Coalition soldiers faced grimmer fates. Those captured were ransomed if they could raise funds, killed if they couldn't. Many returned home wounded, crippled, unable to work. Medieval society had no veterans' benefits. Wounded soldiers became beggars or relied on church charity. The young Squire Otto, who fled the battle, returned to Brunswick in shame. His family's fortunes declined with the emperor's. He would never speak of Bouvines to his children, though his grandson would find among his possessions a rusted piece of armor with French sword cuts, the only physical evidence of his participation in history's turning point. Bouvines demonstrates how individual leadership shapes historical outcomes. Philip's calm, strategic thinking, his personal courage when unhorsed, his ability to inspire troops through example, these were decisive. Otto, equally brave but less tactically skilled and politically astute, learned that courage alone doesn't win battles. Leadership in medieval warfare required a unique combination, reflects Dr. Matthew Strickland, author of War and Chivalry. Physical courage was necessary, but not sufficient. The best commanders, Philip, Richard I, Edward I, combined personal bravery with strategic vision and the ability to inspire loyalty. Otto had the first but lacked the others. France won because Philip had created something approaching national unity. His soldiers fought not just for personal glory or feudal obligation, but for France, an abstract concept becoming real. The coalition, despite numerical superiority, was exactly that. A coalition of diverse interests, lacking common purpose beyond defeating Philip. This lesson would repeat throughout history. Coalitions, whether the Holy League against Napoleon or the Allies against Hitler, succeed only when held together by common interest and effective leadership. Without these, numerical superiority means little. Otto's Holy Roman Empire seemed invincible before Bouvines. 5 hours later, it was finished as a major power. The Angevin Empire, dominant for 50 years, never recovered from John's defeat. These collapses remind us that apparent strength often masks internal weakness, that empires can fall with stunning speed when their fundamental contradictions are exposed. If Otto's scouts had found Philip a day earlier or later, the battle might never have occurred. If Philip's horse hadn't been killed, he would never have been in danger. If Pierre Mauvoisin had hesitated a second longer, Philip might have died. If any of a dozen small events had occurred differently, France as we know it might not exist. This unpredictability humbles us. We like to think history follows logical paths toward inevitable destinations. Bouvines reminds us that accident, chance, and individual choice matter enormously. The tiniest variables can cascade into world-changing consequences. Which side was right at Bouvines? Philip was defending conquered territories taken from England. John and Otto were trying to recover legitimately held lands. Both sides committed atrocities. Both claimed God's favor. Both believed their cause just. The lack of clear moral distinction teaches humility about historical judgment. We can analyze outcomes. France benefited, England suffered, Europe changed, without pretending one side wore white hats and the other black. History is morally complex. Righteousness claims should be viewed skeptically. On a Sunday afternoon in July 1214, on muddy fields near an obscure Flemish village, the modern world was born. France became France. England became England. The Holy Roman Empire began its long decline. The seeds of Magna Carta were planted. National identity triumphed over imperial universalism. None of the participants knew they were making modern Europe. Philip thought he was defending his throne. Otto sought to restore his prestige. Common soldiers fought for pay, glory, or survival. But their collective actions in 5 hours of slaughter created political realities that endure 8 centuries later. Bouvines reminds us that we are all embedded in history, that our actions ripple forward in ways we cannot predict, that the ordinary choices we make under pressure can combine with others to create extraordinary consequences. As the sun set on July 27, 1214, as the screams of the dying faded, as exhausted soldiers collapsed among the corpses, as Philip offered prayers of thanks and Otto fled into exile, as French celebration met coalition despair, in that moment, the medieval world gave way to something new. That something new was the system of nation-states that still structures our world. It was the idea that kings govern through consent, not divine right, an idea that would lead to democracy. It was French identity, English identity, the notion that geography and language and culture create political community. Philip II of France, the bold, suspicious, calculating king who refused to die in the mud, helped birth the modern world. He would have been baffled by this assessment. He was simply trying to survive another battle, defeat another enemy, secure his throne for another year. But history is made by those who show up, who fight when they could flee, who stand when they could kneel. Philip showed up. And in showing up, in fighting 5 desperate hours against superior numbers, in rallying when thrown from his horse, in refusing to accept defeat, he changed everything. The fields of Bouvines are quiet now. Housing developments and farms cover ground where thousands died. A small monument marks the battle site, visited by French school children and history enthusiasts. The Marque River still flows as it did 8 centuries ago, indifferent to the human drama once enacted on its banks. But the consequences of that July Sunday echo still. Every time we think of France as a distinct nation, every time we value democratic governance over absolute monarchy, every time we recognize that ordinary people can shape extraordinary events, we inherit the legacy of Bouvines. The battle teaches us that history is not made by impersonal forces, but by human beings making choices under terrible pressure. That courage and cunning can overcome superior numbers. That a single day can change centuries. That we are all, whether we know it or not, participants in history, our actions rippling forward into futures we cannot imagine. On July 27, 1214, France was born, England transformed, and empire humbled. All because a dying king refused to stay dead, an ambitious emperor overreached, and thousands of ordinary people fought with extraordinary courage for causes they believed just. That is Bouvines. That is history. That is us, reflected in the blood-stained mirror of the past.